One myth found in American history books is the unconditional surrender of Japan in 1945. Japan never surrendered unconditionally, but accepted the terms of the Allies' July 26, 1945 Potsdam Declaration, which stipulated, quote, "We call upon the government of Japan to proclaim now the unconditional surrender of all Japanese armed forces, and to provide proper and adequate assurances of their good faith in such action. The alternative for Japan is prompt and utter destruction." The Potsdam Declaration did not demand the unconditional surrender of the country of Japan, but of all Japanese armed forces, and promised Japan a full democracy with economic freedom as long as their industries were not making weapons. The Japanese accepted this with the stipulation that the emperor could remain as a symbolic leader. This was agreed to, and the government continued after Japan was under control of the supreme commander of Allied powers, Douglas MacArthur. Japan had sent messages indirectly to the United States that it wanted to discuss surrender beginning in February of 1945, 6 months before the war ended. The only condition was that the Emperor Hirohito would remain the symbolic ruler of Japan. These overtures were rejected because the Empire of Japan was Asia's worst mass murderer since Genghis Khan's Mongol army. Imagine if Adolf Hitler were allowed to remain in Berlin as a symbolic leader after World War II. Emperor Hirohito was not a naive gardener, as post-war propaganda assert. He was a career army officer, took the throne in 1926, and authorized the attack on Pearl Harbor and the invasion of the Philippines. During the invasion of Wuhan, China in 1938, the emperor authorized the use of toxic gas on 375 separate occasions, despite the resolution adopted by the League of Nations condemning Japanese use of toxic gas. President Franklin Roosevelt's policy of unconditional surrender was continued by President Truman when he entered office in April of 1945. World War II ended with a divided Europe, and it was obvious that a conditional surrender may have produced a better result with a free Eastern Europe. As Soviet forces assembled to invade Japan, accepting Japan's conditional surrender offer gained political support to prevent a divided Japan. In addition, thousands of American GIs were killed each month in bloody battles in the Philippines and Okinawa. Almost 1 million casualties were expected during the invasion of Japan, which might result in a messy insurgency for years after. The Soviets promised to join the war against Japan in August and were assembling forces to invade northern Japan and Korea. This map depicts a possible partition if the Americans had refused Japan's conditional surrender offer, and the war continued until 1946 with the conquest of Japan. The Soviets did enter the war a few days before Japan surrendered, and it promptly seized southern Sakhalin and northern Korea. Allen Dulles was chief of OSS operations in Switzerland and subsequently director of the CIA. In his 1966 book, A Secret Surrender, Dulles recalled that, quote, "On July 20, 1945, under instruction from Washington, I went to the Potsdam Conference and reported there to Secretary of War Stimson on what I had learned from Tokyo. They desired to surrender if they could retain the emperor and their constitution as the basis for maintaining discipline and order in Japan after the devastating news of the surrender became known to the Japanese people." End quote. The United States eventually agreed to Japan's demand that the emperor remain. This was no secret when the war ended, and newspapers reported there were terms of surrender. After the war, the unconditional surrender myth entered American history books, even though the truth can be read in the CIA's historical library, linked below, where an article by historian Josette Williams notes the day after the second atomic bomb was dropped, Japan transmitted another surrender proposal. Quote, "Washington hotly debated Japan's request for modification of the Potsdam Accord. Historian Robert Butow details the opposing arguments. One side was convinced that acceding to Japan's proviso would inspire prolonged fighting. The other side held that assuring the emperor's continued status as head of state would strengthen post-war reformation. In the end, Secretary of State Byrnes prevailed and prepared the Allied nations' reply, stipulating that the emperor could remain as sovereign ruler, but from that moment of surrender, the authority of the emperor and the Japanese government to rule the state shall be subject to the supreme commander of Allied powers. With the concurrence of the United Kingdom, China, Australia, and ultimately the USSR, the reply was forwarded to Japan through Switzerland. General Douglas MacArthur had lived in Tokyo prior to the war and understood Japanese culture and politics. He was allowed to make secret assurances to the Japanese to finalize the surrender deal. This is an official photo of MacArthur in Manila on August 20th, awaiting the arrival of a Japanese delegation to discuss surrender arrangements. The Japanese sent a delegation to Manila to negotiate the exact terms of surrender. They were pleased with secret deals that led to controversy during the 1946 war crimes tribunals. Not only was the emperor exempted from war crimes prosecutions, but all members of the royal family who served as generals in the Japanese army. The U.S. military began detailed planning for the surrender and occupation of Japan in May of 1945, 3 months before Japan surrendered. This was known as Operation Blacklist, and details can be read in the U.S. Army's official history linked below. When he arrived in Tokyo to take charge of Japan, General Douglas MacArthur did not expel the emperor from his luxurious, massive palace, but stayed in a hotel. He visited the emperor a few days later, but left the government operating. This upset many allies and allowed Japanese nationalists to claim that Japan was never defeated. Many Japanese were angry at the devastation caused by the war, and protests outside the imperial palace were frequent as communist movements appeared. Hundreds of Allied troops were assigned to guard the imperial palace. MacArthur saw the emperor as a symbol of the continuity and cohesion of the Japanese people and a confirmed capitalist. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, also known as the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, was a military trial convened on April 29, 1946, by 11 Allied nations to try the leaders of the Empire of Japan for conspiracy to start and wage war. Some historians criticize the decision to exonerate the emperor and all members of the imperial family implicated in war crimes, such as Prince Hirohito Asaka, pictured, a career officer in the Imperial Japanese Army, and an uncle by marriage of Emperor Hirohito. Prince Asaka was commander of the Japanese forces responsible for the Nanking Massacre in 1937, but was never charged. China lost over 14 million people during the war. It was not pleased with his pardon. Historian John Dower wrote that the campaign to absolve Emperor Hirohito of responsibility, quote, knew no bounds, end quote. He argued that with MacArthur's full approval, the prosecution effectively acted as a defense team for the emperor, who was presented as, quote, an almost saintly figure. Emperor Hirohito continued to live in luxury and was treated as an esteemed royal figure until his death in 1989 at age 87. If Japan was willing to surrender, then why were there 2 atomic bombs dropped? Historians agree that Truman wanted to intimidate the Soviets. Some note that the Manhattan Project to develop these bombs cost billions of dollars, and the Pentagon wanted to justify this program. Army Air Force generals were upset that Operation Starvation, the aerial mining of Japanese ports by B-29s in April 1945, was far more effective than strategic bombing. Moreover, dropping the atomic bombs provided a nice story of why Japan surrendered, to hide the fact the war could have ended sooner. Japan did not surrender because 2 atomic bombs were dropped. Evidence suggests that the war was prolonged until the atomic bombs could be dropped, on August 6th and 9th. The next day, on August 10th, 1945, the Americans finally accepted Japan's conditional surrender.